And you mentioned Bernie Sanders, and who, of course, I think was one of the people trying to kind of create a more equitable world that's not so, capitalistic in nature, or at least not as many victims of the system of inequality, which has been so perpetuated. And that, of course, brings to mind the way the media treated Bernie Sanders. Of course, there was the infamous Bernie blackout that was talked about widely in lefty circles, although obviously not in the mainstream media, hence the title or name. And we talk to a lot of candidates here at the Vanguard that are funded through grassroots means, small dollar donations. They're not reliant on the corporate machine or the lobbyist industries, which so many politicians in DC are. And usually they say that pretty much, if not the biggest, but one of the biggest obstacles that they consistently face is the mainstream media. Whether it's because they're not being covered equitably, or they're not being covered fairly, or they're the victim of smear campaigns. We've seen this over and over again. And concurrently to this, we see on the right wing this very scary phenomenon where lots of right wingers are kind of leaving any and all sense of reality. They're leaving even Fox News, because that's too based in reality for them. It's not affirming their ridiculous notions and these conspiracy theories that have been sowed by the likes of Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani about the election and these claims of fraud, which haven't really come to fruition. So, it's this interesting place where on the left, you don't ever want to fall into that kind of a thing where you just lose touch with reality and, stop paying attention to any, quote unquote, authoritative sources, any mainstream media outlets, because a lot of, good reporting is subsidized by, the New York Times or CNN, or at least it was at one point. And regardless of their, opinion editorials and that kind of stuff, journalism has to be funded through somewhere. And, as much as we love the Patreon and Substack model, I think that we would agree that the funding has to come for, some big budget journalism from somewhere. And I just wanted to get your perspective on what the left should do as a movement, or I guess at least on an individual level as a, consumer of news and media, how we can kind of consciously combat this supremacy of the corporate mainstream media while also supporting great journalism and making sure that, that tradition doesn't die off.
That's a great question.
Appreciate it.
So, tell you what, if you figured it out, you let me know. I mean, no, I think like this is exactly where our heads need to be at. And I guess there are a couple of things that I would say, because I think the more people we have thinking about this question, the better. Right. And I don't just say that out of a self-interested, nerdy place because my degrees were in media studies and history, media history and stuff. So in one sense, I need that to be true in order to justify all that fucking time that I spent, reading these books. But in another, reading about the history of the changing media landscape in the US and in Mexico, even in parts of Europe, right? It was all very enlightening to me because I see media and politics as fundamentally intertwined in any historical epoch, right? I mean, again, if politics is, fundamentally a team sport, if it is fundamentally a mass sport, right, then you need the actual media, going all the way back to the Latin roots, media being the things that connect us, the things that connect that which is separated, right? Media are the kind of relations and tendrils that bind us to one another, that communicate information to one another, right? We ourselves are being mediums right now, bringing our audiences in conversation with one another. And we're communicating through technology that, conveys the thoughts in our head through the language that's coming out of our mouths, yada, yada, yada. Media is everywhere, right? My whole dissertation was premised on the notion that media are the connective tissue of being, that we cannot be who we are without being connected to our other people and to the world that we're a part of. And media, that we are who we are, always in conversation with the world, and media are the facilitators of that conversation, right? That's what I spent 400 fucking pages writing. That's basically it, right? So in order to kind of make that less abstract, right? In every historical epoch, right? The question of how we communicate our political program, how we reach people, how we get them on our side, how we gain intel about what struggles they're facing, what the power structures of their worlds like are, where they come from, where they're vulnerable, right? All of that. And not just that, but also how we, move through time and space, how we preserve traditions, whether in songs or oral traditions or literature, history, right? That is the past communicating to us in ways that are politically necessary. Otherwise, we're always going to be reinventing the wheel, right? We are always part of an ongoing political struggle that stretches back to the beginning of time, right? And so, that includes methods of transportation, right? It includes methods of communication and preservation of memory and, all that good stuff.
It kind of reminds me a little bit about the work that, and maybe if I'm off base a little bit here, but there's this book, Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, came out in the 80s. And he kind of went on this idea about like when the medium actually that you're using to convey these political idea changes. So he was commenting on it with, changing largely from print to television, that the way that people were receiving these ideas is now changed because the communication method is different. And so what sticks and what people, are able to, receive at a greater level changes. Do you think that's going to be evidenced again in the changes that we see with the internet?
Yes, I do. So I think, let's see, because I think, bringing up Neil Postman is great. And I'm trying to make sure that I can like tie that back to what I was just saying, because I think they're fundamentally connected. Because, essentially what I was getting at, right, with that whole spiel on media, right, a more elemental understanding of media, is that what we call the mainstream media, right, are these outsized pillars of that kind of media ecology, to use Neil Postman's term, that we're all a part of, right? So like a lot of the connections that could be made between us, right? A lot of the things that could be informing us in our politics and how we relate to one another are channeled through mainstream media, right? And that infrastructure has been set up over centuries, which is what Neil Postman talks about. I actually kind of cite that same book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, in a piece that I wrote for the Baffler a couple of years ago called the Real World Trump Edition. But I tried to basically explain how to understand how we got to Trump, you need to go all the way back to the Telegraph, right? Because, and I apologize for listeners because this is going to be a very Spark Notes version of what I talk about there, right? But Postman identifies the Telegraph as a kind of tectonic shift in media history, right? Because until that point, you think about the function of the free press, you think about the function of local news. It wasn't called that at the time, but that's what it was. News was fundamentally local because it was a medium that was established in a local community that was limited by the bounds of physics and by the technology of the day, right? So if you were going to be reporting on or commenting on, relevant information, if you were going to make your newspaper in, the colonies or whatever the fuck survive, right, you needed information that people in your immediate sphere could recognize and in fact could use, right? You were handing information, that you were conveying information through this medium that, again, like it was part of their being. It allowed them to live in a certain way. It allowed them to live more effectively in their worlds and to know what was going on with agriculture, with business, with culture, with politics, and to then kind of act in the world as a more kind of informed citizen, right? With the parentheses that like that was white landowning males at the time. With the telegraph and with the train system, we broke those kinds of barriers. We were now suddenly able to convey information through time and space at a hitherto unprecedented pace, right? And so what that meant for newspapers and the news industry was that the information that made it onto their pages was not just kind of limited to what the people making those newspapers could source in their local communities. It was coming through the telegraph, right? And so now you had an ever enlarging, like the increasing amount of information that has come through those wires has never gotten like smaller. It has only gotten bigger since then, right? And so the amount of information that keeps coming in forces an evolution in the news industry where suddenly people who have newspapers or, you know, little independent publications, right, you know, and if they had access to, you know, those telegraph communications, because at a time a lot of those were really monopolized by certain companies. It was only in the 20th century that they started to become a bit more democratically accessible in the US and abroad. But anyway, as it becomes more accessible, as more papers and more outlets get access to that information that's coming from beyond their local spheres, and I say this as an editor now, you have to then make decisions about what to put on the finite amount of paper for this week's issue, right? And so then what influences that calculus? What influences the decisions you're making about what to keep and what to cut and how to present it? That is where the capitalist kind of like underpinnings of the American media system really start to show themselves, right? That is where the penny press really kind of emerged as a dominant cultural force in the late 19th century and early 20th century, right? Because if you sell papers at a lower cost, if you're not supplementing the cost of your papers through advertisements, then what you're really banking on is selling a shit ton of copies. And how you do that is by selling what sells, right? Blood, right? You know, like the if it bleeds, it leads, right? I mean, so you get, you know, a news system that gets hooked and addicted to the shallow and the sensational, right? And in many ways, we haven't outgrown that, right? In many ways, we're kind of in that ecosphere, that ecosystem on hyperdrive, right? Because now we are consuming more information than ever at a quicker pace than ever. And we're consuming it in like smaller and smaller bits through tweets, through headlines, through whatever we hear in podcasts and manage to retain. This is what Neil Postman calls the problem of information glut, right? And I think the reason I go into that in detail, and I apologize, you guys hit a nerve here. The reason I think it's so important to understand why information glut is a concept worth understanding is because Postman, more than anyone else at the time, saw that had political ramifications, because he said that if you are a consumer of media, right, and every day you are getting more and more information from the world beyond your local sphere, from news from outside of the country, news from other states, news now today about the environment, about wars in other lands, about this world that we seem to be like only watching through 3D glasses while it's on fire. The thing that he points out is that throws off the information action ratio. He says, when you have a glut of information, you have a poverty of action, because you can't do much with all that information except consume it and move on to the next, you know, thing, because the information is always coming and we just keep getting fatter and fatter on these tidbits of information. But then we lose the very purpose of what a free press was meant to be, right? It's not just to keep us informed about what's going on. Like I said earlier, it's about giving us information that we can act on, that can make us better democratic actors and stewards of democracy itself. We don't have that now. We have been forced into the position, and mainstream media has accelerated this for over a century. It has put us in the position of the constant position of consumers, not as democratic, engaged actors in the world that we're a part of, but really just spectators to a world that is fed to us through these media.